Camping is supposed to be peaceful, crackling fires, quiet nights, and the comfort of nature all around. But when the sun sets and the forest grows dark, the woods become a place of shadows, a place where you're never quite sure what's watching from beyond the tree line. Tonight, we're diving into terrifying true stories of campers who encountered things far from normal, from unexplainable whispers in the night, to figures lurking just outside the tent, to abandoned sites that should never have been found. These are the creepiest things seen while camping, so zip up your tent, keep your fire burning bright, and listen closely, because once you hear these stories, you may never want to camp again. The Whispering Tent. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip. Alex and his girlfriend, Nina, had planned to camp in a national forest just a few hours from their city. They weren't hardcore campers, just two young people looking to escape the noise of everyday life. They packed light, a tent, sleeping bags, some food, and a small camping stove. The kind of trip that should have been uneventful, peaceful, safe. They arrived late in the afternoon, when the sun was already sinking toward the horizon. The forest looked beautiful at first all, evergreens rising like spires, their branches whispering in the breeze. A faint trail led them deeper until they found a clearing by a stream, perfect for pitching their tent. The air smelled of pine and wet earth, and the only sounds were birdsong and the babble of water. As the fire crackled that night, Alex felt a sense of calm, the kind that only comes from being far away from cities, screens, and people. He and Nina roasted marshmallows, laughed, and watched the stars appear overhead. It was idyllic until the first sound broke the peace. It was faint, almost unnoticeable at first. A rustle. Somewhere in the trees beyond the firelight, they both froze, ears straining. Probably just a deer, Alex said after a moment, forcing a smile. He tossed another log into the fire, its sparks jumping like fireflies. But Nina wasn't convinced. That didn't sound like an animal, she whispered. The noise stopped, and eventually they crawled into their tent. The night was chilly, the canvas walls rattling softly in the wind. Alex drifted toward sleep, but sometime around midnight, he woke. Not because of movement, not because of cold, but because of a voice. It was faint, a whisper. At first, he thought it was Nina, maybe talking in her sleep. But when he turned, she was still breathing deeply beside him. The whisper came again. From outside, his skin crawled. It was too low to make out the words, but the sound circled the tent, slow, deliberate. The canvas shifted slightly, as if something brushed against it. Alex held his breath, his pulse hammering in his ears. He strained to listen, his body rigid with fear, and then he heard it clearer this time. His name, Alex. The whisper was stretched, drawn out, barely more than breath, but unmistakable. Every muscle in his body locked. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. His mouth went dry as he stared at the thin fabric wall of the tent, knowing that someone was just beyond it. He shook Nina gently. Her eyes fluttered open, annoyed at first, until she saw the look on his face. He pressed a finger to his lips. "Listen," he mouthed. At first, she heard nothing. Then the whisper came again. But this time, it was her name. Nina. Her face drained of color. She grabbed Alex's arm, squeezing tight. "That's not funny," she whispered. "It's not me," he hissed back. The whisper circled them, moving from one side of the tent to the other. Never hurried, never loud, always just enough to send their hearts into overdrive. "What do we do?" Nina mouthed. Alex thought about unzipping the tent, shining their flashlight out, but every instinct screamed that was the worst thing they could do. Whatever it was, wanted them to look, wanted them to acknowledge it. So they sat there, frozen, listening. The whispers grew softer, fainter, until finally, the night was silent again. They didn't sleep after that. At the first hint of dawn, Alex unzipped the tent cautiously and peered out. The forest looked normal. Birds chirped. The stream bubbled. Nothing out of place. But when he stepped outside, his blood turned cold. In the soft dirt around their tent, circling it completely, were footprints. Bare, human. And every set of prints pointed inward. Toward the tent. That was enough for them. They packed their things in record time and left the forest without a word. The silence between them heavy with the weight of what they'd heard. To this day, Alex swears the whispers knew their names because something had been watching them long before they went to sleep. Something in the woods that wasn't meant to be heard. The abandoned campsite Tyler and his two best friends, Evan and Mark, had been camping together every summer since high school. It was their traditional way to reconnect, drink a little too much, and swap old stories while pretending they had grown into responsible adults with bills and jobs waiting back home. By their mid-20s, they'd grown confident in the woods. Confident enough to hike past the safe, designated areas and carve out their own little corners of wilderness. That year, they chose a trail that cut deeper into the national forest than they'd ever gone before. The air smelled cleaner out there, and the silence felt heavier, as though the world itself was holding its breath. They liked it, loved it even. But what they found on the second day of their trip would haunt them forever. It started with smoke. They noticed it late in the afternoon, a thin gray wisp curling lazily above the trees in the distance. At first, they thought it was another group of campers. But the odd thing was, the smoke didn't billow upward the way a fresh fire does. It drifted low, spreading out in a strange, hazy way, like the remnants of something that had already burned. Probably just someone's camp, Evan said, though his voice carried more curiosity than certainty. Mark shrugged. Might as well check it out. Maybe they've got beer. Tyler didn't like the idea. Something about the smoke unsettled him, but he followed anyway. After another 20 minutes of hiking, they stumbled into a clearing, and there, nestled between the trees, was the campsite. At first glance, it looked ordinary tents, a circle of stones where a fire had been built. Even backpacks leaned against a log. But when they stepped closer, Tyler felt a knot form in his gut. The fire was nothing but ash, cold and gray. The food half a pot of noodles still sat by the fire pit, congealed and swarming with flies. One of the tents was unzipped, its flaps torn, as though someone had ripped their way out in a hurry. And the strangest thing of all, everything was still there. Sleeping bags, water bottles, clothes, even wallets and phones. Whoever had camped here hadn't just left, they had vanished. Mark whistled low. Weird. Maybe they just panicked and ran, left their wallet. Tyler said, "Their food. Who does that?" The longer they looked, the worse it got. On the ground near the fire were deep gouges, as if something heavy had been dragged through the dirt. A chair was knocked on its side, its metal legs bent inward. "Maybe a bear," Evan suggested, though he sounded less sure by the second. Tyler shook his head. "A bear doesn't unzip tents." They debated leaving immediately, but night was closing in fast. Reluctantly, they set up their own camp a short distance away, telling themselves they'd report the abandoned site when they got back. But that night, none of them slept. The first noise came around midnight, a sharp crack, like a branch snapping. The three of them froze in their sleeping bags, straining to listen. Another crack. Then another. "It's just deer," Evan whispered. But Tyler knew deer didn't walk in circles. Whatever was out there, it was pacing the perimeter of their camp. Slow, deliberate, each step carefully placed in the leaves, moving closer, then drifting away. At one point, Tyler swore he saw a shadow between the trees tall, hunched, watching. But when he blinked, it was gone. They lay in silence, the fire burning low, until a sound shattered the night. A scream. It was high-pitched, ragged, and it came from the direction of the abandoned campsite. A scream that cut off mid-breath, leaving the forest ringing with silence. Mark bolted upright. "We need to go." But where? The trail was long, the night thick, and running blindly through the woods was suicide. Reluctantly, they stayed put, clutching their flashlights like weapons, waiting for the first hint of dawn. The noises continued: footsteps, rustles, sometimes what sounded like laughter, soft and broken. Each sound came from the direction of the abandoned campsite. By the time morning finally came, their nerves were shredded raw. They packed quickly and hiked back toward civilization without a word. When they reached the ranger station hours later, they reported what they had seen. The ranger frowned. "There aren't supposed to be any campsites out there," he said. But when Tyler insisted, the ranger agreed to check it out. 2 days later, the ranger called. "There was nothing there," he said. "No tents, no fire pit, no gear, just trees." Tyler's stomach dropped. He knew what he'd seen. They all did. The campsite had been real. The food, the footprints, the scream in the night, but now it was gone. And sometimes, when Tyler dreams, he hears that ragged cry again, a scream echoing through the forest, from campers who were never supposed to be found. The man without a light camping near lakes had always been Ryan's favorite escape. He loved the reflection of moonlight on still water, the way the forest seemed quieter near the shore. That summer, he went with his cousin Daniel and two of their friends, Jenna and Chris. They picked a spot along a secluded lake that could only be reached by canoe, far away from roads, cabins, and other campers. The first night was perfect. They swam until the sky turned gold, then sat around the fire, roasting hot dogs and trading ghost stories they only half believed. By the time the fire had burned low, they crawled into their tents, lulled to sleep by the lapping water. But sometime in the night, Ryan woke. At first, he didn't know why. The forest was silent, the water calm. Then he realized he wasn't alone. Someone was standing on the other side of the fire. His breath caught. The fire had died down to glowing coals, but there was just enough light to outline a tall figure. A man. He stood at the edge of the campsite, motionless, facing them. Ryan's first thought was that it was another camper who had gotten lost. But then he noticed something strange. The man carried no gear, no pack, no lantern, no flashlight, just himself. In the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere. Ryan didn't move, didn't even breathe. He just stared. Finally, the figure turned, slowly, and stepped back into the trees. The darkness swallowed him whole. Ryan stayed frozen until dawn, too afraid to even wake the others. The next morning, when he told them, they laughed nervously. "You were dreaming," Jenna said. Or it was a ranger. But Ryan knew it hadn't been a dream. That night, as the fire flickered low, they all heard it. Footsteps circling the camp, leaves crunching softly, twigs snapping, slow, measured steps, always just beyond the firelight. Every time Chris shined his flashlight toward the trees, the sound stopped. When he turned it off, the steps began again. They called out once, thinking maybe it really was another camper. No one answered. The silence that followed was heavier than before. Then Jenna whispered, "He doesn't have a light." The truth sank in like a stone. Anyone out there at that hour, in that darkness, would need a light to see. But this manifest was a man walked, as if the woods belonged to him. The footsteps circled them until dawn. The group was rattled, but leaving wasn't simple. The only way out was across the lake, and storms had been rolling in since morning. They decided to stay one more night, convincing themselves they were being paranoid. But the third night was worse. They stayed up late, keeping the fire blazing as high as it would go. Hours passed without incident. And then, without warning, the forest went silent. No frogs, no insects, nothing. Chris leaned forward, whispering, "Do you hear that?" That was when the sound came. Splash from the lake. All of them turned, flashlights cutting across the water. Ripples spread across the surface, slow and wide, as if something had entered from the far shore. Then, from the trees behind them, footsteps again. Closer this time, Ryan's chest seized. They were surrounded. He swept his flashlight across the tree line. For a fraction of a second, he saw it someone standing between the trees. A man, tall and thin, his face lost in shadow. His head tilted slightly, like he was studying them. Ryan's hand shook so badly the beam wavered, and when the light steadied, the figure was gone. The group didn't sleep at all that night. Every rustle, every crack made them jump. The footsteps continued, circling, retreating, returning, until the gray light of morning finally broke the spell. They packed fast, shoving gear into bags, barely speaking. By noon, they were on the water, paddling hard against the current. None of them looked back, but halfway across the lake, Jenna gasped. On the shore, where their camp had been, someone was standing, a man, watching. Still with no light. Ryan never went camping again, and when he tells the story now, he always ends the same way. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't a lost camper. He didn't need a fire. He didn't need a flashlight. He was out there in the dark like he'd always been. Waiting. Watching. And I don't think he ever left. The return to Ashes, Ethan had always thought of camping as a second home. From the time he was a boy, his father had taken him deep into the forests of Oregon, teaching him how to build fires, track animals, and sleep beneath the stars. Without fear. By his 30s, Ethan had camped in nearly every state, and he liked to think he'd seen it. Old bears, wolves, storms. Even a lightning strike that nearly burned down an entire section of forest. But nothing prepared him for what he found when he returned to the clearing. The first time he'd camped there, years earlier, it had been perfect. A wide-open space, a stream nearby for water, and a ring of tall fir trees that sheltered the camp from the wind. He had camped there alone for 3 nights, listening to owls and coyotes, watching the stars, and feeling at peace. Nothing strange had happened. Nothing at all. But the memory of that clearing stayed with him. A picture of calm that he returned to in his mind whenever life felt overwhelming. So, years later, after a breakup and a string of sleepless nights, he decided to go back. He wanted to relive that peace, to remind himself the forest was still his refuge. But when he reached the clearing, his heart dropped. The forest was burnt. Blackened trunks rose like gravestones, their branches skeletal against the pale sky. The ground was ash, dry and brittle beneath his boots. The stream was little more than a trickle of murky water. The air smelled faintly of smoke, though he knew the fire had been years ago. And yet, in the middle of all that ruin, stood something impossible. A tent. Not his old tent, of course, but a newer model green nylon, staked neatly into the ash. It looked recently set up, as though someone had just arrived, but when Ethan called out, no one answered. He circled the tent cautiously. The zipper was half open. Inside was a sleeping bag, laid out neatly. A lantern, even a backpack, stuffed full of clothes and food, but no sign of its owner. And then Ethan froze. The backpack. It was his brand. The same color, the same model. And when he leaned closer, his stomach lurched. The initials sewn into the fabric were his own. This was his pack, the same one he had brought years ago. The one he had thrown away after a tour on a different trip. He staggered back, heart racing. The tent seemed to loom taller, darker, as though the shadows inside it stretched too far. That night, Ethan couldn't bring himself to leave. The sun had already begun to sink, and he knew hiking out in darkness would be suicide. So he built a small fire at the edge of the clearing and tried to ignore the tent. But the tent didn't ignore him. As the fire burned low, he heard Ethan's soft rustle of movement from inside, a zipper sliding, just a fraction, and then slowly, deliberately, the sound of breathing, not his own. Deep, heavy, wet, like lungs that hadn't breathed air in years. He grabbed his flashlight and shined it at the tent. The flap hung open, swaying slightly in the breeze. The sleeping bag was empty. The pack was gone, and yet the breathing continued. It came from the trees, from all around him. Shadows shifted at the edge of the firelight, tall and thin, circling just out of sight. The burned trunks seemed to bend, as though watching. Ethan didn't sleep. He sat by the fire, clutching his knife, whispering prayers he hadn't said since childhood. Every time the fire died down, the breathing grew closer until he fed the flames again. When dawn finally came, he packed, nothing, just ran. His gear, his food, his pride, all of it stayed behind in that clearing of ash. He never returned to the forest again. And yet, sometimes, when he closes his eyes at night, Ethan swears he still hears it. The sound of a zipper sliding open, the sound of his own name whispered from the ashes.